Hi there everyone, I hope I find you well. I'm Jennifer Kirk, welcoming you back up here into the loft on Weir Yard. Now today I'm going to be doing a little project to fit a Dapol working semaphore signal to Weir Yard. Up until now, all of the semaphore signals on Weir Yard are pretty much non-working ratio kits. Although a couple of them can be posed, I've always had great difficulty in getting the ratio kits to work remotely. Now it can be done, I have done it in the past, but they are tremendously delicate, and once they break, they tend to break for good, which really it didn't really suit what I wanted to do up here. So I've picked up one of the Dapol signals. They've been on the market actually for a number of years and are available in a number of different guises: Southern Railway, LMS, and also Great Western Lower Quadrant. And the one that I've picked up, I've actually gone for the Southern Railway lattice signal, even though Weir Yard is notionally set in the northeast of England. And the reason for this is that the LMiD did tend to use a lattice style of signalling, so I thought actually they would probably fit in quite well. Now I picked one up for a pretty good price, and what I actually want to do is to incorporate this into the layout in such a way that it doesn't really need user intervention. It will just work, and to do this I've very kindly been sent two of the LMiD detectors from the DCC Concepts range, and I'm really grateful for their help in supplying these for part of this review. Now what I'm going to be doing with these is creating two sections on the layout, so when the train goes through these I'm going to use them to trigger the signal. The actual mechanism of the Dapol signal is quite simple. You've got your power feed, really important to keep that voltage down to the specifications. I know a lot of people had problems with these, with over voltaging them, but I'm going to keep that down as low as I can get it to go. Probably about 6 or 7 volts should be about right. And the triggering mechanism is done by basically completing a circuit with the other two wires underneath the signal. Now the LMiD detectors, normally you would power these, but I've got a suspicion that if I don't put power to these, and this is really important, they will act like a switch on the circuit, and that will allow them to trigger the Dapol signal without actually sending voltage down the triggering wires. And that is really important. If you send a voltage down these wires, you will, no questions asked, destroy your signal. So I'm going to have a go at doing this. It's really off-piste. This isn't a method that DCC Concepts have in their manual. This is just a theory, but I'm going to see if I can get that to work. So without further ado, come with me and let's see if we can get the Dapol signal to work reliably with remote triggering. And this is suitable for DC or DCC users because it is completely independent of what is powering the track. So for today's project, I've got here one of the Dapol signals, semaphore signals. They've been on the market for quite some time, and I really like the look of these. Now, I've tried building ratio kits in the past, and getting them to work whilst possible is incredibly long-winded. And I just felt when I saw this in the shop that the quality of this was just far in excess of what I could achieve with model kits. So I'm going to give this a go. And I thought I think I paid £26 for this. I just thought that it was incredibly good value when you compared to what you would have to do to make your own signals. Now, back in the day when I was a child, I was a huge fan of the Hornby 00 signals, and they had a range of working signals back then, which, whilst they don't necessarily hold their own now, did actually have a very simple way of acting. And I believe that whilst these have a different actuation, that there's a similar idea going on. Looking at the instructions online, there's a power feed, 2 wires. Now it does say quite what I think is quite a high voltage, and I've heard a lot of people say that actually these run a lot better if you lower that voltage. And indeed I found the same with my water tower, and I've had no problems whatsoever running that on about 3 to 4 volts. So I'm going to try and run this on 5 volts and see if it works. If that doesn't, then I'll find a way of getting a little bit of extra power to it, but that's my idea. Now I've gone for the Southern Railway lattice signals because the London and North Eastern Railway, which is notionally where Yard is set, also used the lattice design for their signals. So I think it's probably the closest match that I'm going to get. And also at the moment, the LMS upper quadrant signals are proving incredibly difficult to get hold of. So this is what was available. Now, what I want to look into is how to actually make this work. Now, yes, I could just have something like a push button switch, and the second set of wires, you just have a momentary contact and it would change. And well, that's probably good enough for most people. But for me, I want something a little bit more. And what I'm going to look into doing is actually adding a detector section somewhere before the signal. In fact, actually probably quite a way before the signal. With the idea being that that is going to make the signal clear the track. Then the train will come through. The signal is set clear. It'll go through. And then what I've got is a second one of these legacy LMiD detectors, which is going to go after the signal. So once the train has gone through, it passes through the section that this is detecting on, and that will return the signal to danger. The train will go round the layout, go into the section that this is detecting on, that will clear the signal, and the whole cycle repeats. Now, I am also going to wire in one of these Hornby 00 push button switches, simply so that if for whatever reason the signal gets out of sync with the detectors, it's very easy with one push to return it to the sync that I want, because the track's not going to be interlocked with the signal. So you would then end up with the signal actually going to clear after the train has passed through it, set to danger. And so that's going to be the simple project for today. So what I'm going to do now is just look at one of these legacy LMiD detectors. Now this is a product from DCC Concepts. They actually sent these over for review quite a while ago, and I've just never got round to finding a project that I could use them for until now. Now, you might be familiar with these if you set up occupancy detection, say in hidden fiddle yard sidings, and that is one of the uses that you can use these for. But I'm going to use this effectively as a switch for this signal, and I can wire this and the second one and the push button all to the same set of wires coming out of this, and effectively the signal can be triggered by either of these or the push button switch. It doesn't really matter because you're not going to be using all three at the same time. Now I'm just going to take this out of the packaging, and it does come with pretty comprehensive and simple to understand instructions on the back, but if you need to, you can look up more information about them off the DCC Concepts website. And there's also a pack of fixing screws, and that's simply for fixing this most usually to the underside of the baseboard. At first glance, the design of the circuit board is looks a little bit weird if you're not used to some of these big components that we've got here. But actually, I'm going to talk you through how this works. And really, it's only down to your imagination as to limiting what you could then use this for. On the track, we gap a section, just like we did either with an insulated siding or even the ABC modules. But what we're then going to do is we're going to run a dropper wire from that isolated rail. It's going to come down, and then it's going to go through this coil unit, loop round and go through it again, and then that's going to go to our main bus feed. So that dropper wire doesn't actually have any connection to this other than it's passing through this coil. But when your locomotive then goes into that section, because it's still drawing power, there's then a current set up in that dropper wire. And where it loops through this coil, you then, through induction, get a field set up and a current then is created. And that's what this board is detecting. Now you might use this for things like occupancy detection. So when a train is sat there in that section, it's drawing a power. On DCC, of course, it's still drawing something, even if it's not moving. And then you can use that to make an LED light up on your panel to tell you that something is there. And that's probably the use for these that most modelers would be familiar with. But my plan is to use it as a switch to actually switch this signal. And the way I'm going to do that is, if we look to the instructions, we can see what all the terminals do. We've got input A, which is there, and there we can add either 12 volts DC. It has to be regulated. It's always important you need regulated power, and that just means it won't fluctuate, because that's going to probably risk damaging delicate circuitry, but also it will make it very difficult for these devices to accurately do what they need to do. Then we've got output B and output C on these screw terminals, and we're going to be using output B. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to connect this to the switching terminals of the actual signal, but you can also connect it to something like a relay, like the Cobalt Rex, accessory decoder, or even a digital turnout motor to actually change them. So we could actually set this up to change the points using the switch terminal inputs on something like the ADS units that we installed in an earlier video. Then we've also got output C. This basically is for switching things that need a slightly higher voltage and current. In fact, looking at this, I am suspecting that I don't need to apply track voltage to there, because I don't need to actually send power to this signal. All we're effectively doing is briefly making that circuit and then opening it again to get the signal to change. So I'm going to look into that, and in the installation I'll talk you through whether we need the actual power feed into this or not. And I suspect we don't, because we don't want to be sending power to the signal. We simply just want to complete a circuit to the signal. Looking to the other components we've got here, the switch, any push button, push to make switch will do. This just came from the control panels where a lot of switches have been liberated from when I've gone digital on a lot of my point work. So it makes sense to use what I've already got. And this just happens to be a Hornby 00 push to make switch of the kind that came with the electric uncoupling rails or the TPO sets back in the day. What I want to do now is just take a close look at the signal. So I'm going to take this out of the box, and this packaging is basically a use once type packaging. So we've got in here, let's take a good close look at this signal. Pretty well packaged. Just going to lift that out, and this is our signal. There's also some instructions in here which you can see on the backing card there. We'll come to them in a bit, but you can see that this signal is absolutely beautiful, with an etched metal ladder. We've got a walkway there, and that really fine lattice work. It is quite resilient as well, and the mechanism does seem to stand up to a little bit of prodding. I'm not going to try my luck too much, but really does look a nice piece of scenic kit. And I'll be honest with you, for £26, even if these were sold as a posable item, that's probably actually quite a good price for them. So the fact that they work, it does make them amazingly good value. Now, to fit them, we're going to need to drill a hole, which this then drops down through. We take this nut off, drop it in, and then we can screw this nut back up on the underside, and that then just clamps that to the underside of the baseboard and holds it in place. And then we can scenic over the top of this just to hide that base. And underneath we've got two sets of wires. So what we've actually got here is a pair of yellow wires and then a red and black, and one of these is the power feed to the signal. constantly powered, because we've actually got an LED on here which will show either the green or the red aspect, and then the other is for making momentary contact for the signal to actually change. That's how I understand it. So really, really nice piece of kit. So I've opened up here the instructions, and actually this is an incredibly simple set of instructions, and that's what we want. We don't want complication, so we quite simply, black and red, that's what we're going to be feeding the power into the signal with, and then we're just going to bridge these two contacts using a passing contact switch. That's our Hornby 00 switch. And we're also going to be using the switching output of this as well, and the other one too. One of the first things that I want to do is to test the signal and just make sure everything works as it should before I do the installation. So what I've got here is just a 9-volt battery. I've got my push button switch wired up to the yellow terminals, and then the black and the red is the power to the signal. So we're going to put the red to the positive terminal and then black to the negative, and you'll see that the light comes on. And there we go. Press it again. And if you just wanted to be able to power this from a push button, you didn't want any of the automation, this is pretty much where you would stop. But we want to go further, so now that I know that the signal works perfectly, I can move on to, I'm going to install it. I will get the push button switch in because I'm going to need that to reset the signal if it gets out of sync. But then we're going to look to adding in the LMIDs to get that automation that I'm looking for. With regards to location for this project, I'm looking at this signal here, which is currently a non-working ratio signal. It's actually salvaged from Bolton Trinity Road, and I'm going to look to replace this with the Dapol signal. Now if we look underneath here, that signal is inconveniently just sited on top of this structural support. So if I move it back a little bit, then the actual motor and base will be here in the gloom, and that will give it some degree of protection, and it'll end up being mounted just back here a little bit. I'm going to have to remove this signal, and what I will do is I'll just grass over where it's been, so you won't actually tell that it's been there, and that should be fine. And this won't go to waste. I will use this somewhere else on the layout where operation isn't really key. Now it can be posed, so that's absolutely fine. And then that will mean that we've got a relatively long stretch of track going down the gradient, and somewhere down near the bottom I'm going to put in the section that will return that signal to the clear position as the train comes round. It'll come up here, it'll go past the signal, and then I will see if it's possible to then gap the track and put another section in just after it, and that will be what returns the signal to danger. Now I could have put the section a little bit further on round the line, but the problem is getting access to underneath that track to feed a dropper through is pretty much impossible. So I'd just be making a lot of work for myself. So I think moving the signal just back to here a little bit will help out a lot. I've got the old signal removed. You can see the hole where it came out of. Came out in one piece, absolutely no problem. And I've drilled the hole, and as you can just see there, cleared up the area so that the base of the Dapol signal should now fit flat. I'm just going to have to prise some of these bushes just out of the way. I fed the wires through, making sure it sits flat and at 90 degrees to the track, and I can now fasten this in. I already know it works because we tested it, and that'll be the major installation stage of this. I still need to put a gap in the track just behind here, and I may have to experiment. I think as long as I make it long enough that something like a class 25 will fit entirely in the section, then that should be all right to trigger the after section to return this to danger. The Dapol signal installation is actually really easy. So I've got it in place now. The bottom of the signal comes down, and you can just see all the wires I've put into that chock block. which then enables me to have the manual push button switch. I can press that button and press it again. So we've got a manual changing on the signal. It's quite discreet under there, but it does allow some manual control of that signal, but actually it's there to sync it more than anything. So I'm going to get on now and start gapping the rails and putting down some new dropper wires, some of which will go through those LMiD detectors. And then hopefully, fingers crossed, all going well, we will have a fully automated signal. Underneath the layout, this is the detector. So I've got a wire running from just there where I've gapped between the two sections. I'm going to cover those wires so they're not obvious. I've got a power feed to give me good reliable running on this section because I cut the rail just in case. And then the yellow wire is going down and it's going round and through that loop. It becomes a green wire because I've got a chop block on it. And then I'm going from terminal B. I'm not powering the LMiD because I don't want it to generate a current to feed into the signal, because that's not how the signal works. It could damage it. Instead, it's changing the resistance. I tried it with my multimeter and there's no change in voltage, but there is a change in resistance. And that's what the signal needs in order to change. So I've got this section in and it's currently set to danger, but I'll fix that. And there, trigger. So as the train's entering this section, it's triggering the signal. But what I've actually found is that by making this section longer, it's not triggering the signal on the way out, only the way in. And I think this is to do with the length of wire back to the LMiD. So I still need to add the second section in, I think, for reliable running. But I'm going to take away from how this section has worked that I need to make a long section with the power feed only at the far end, the furthest end away from the signal. Otherwise, what I've actually found is when I run the train in reverse, it does trigger the signal when it enters the section over there, but then it triggers it a second time when it leaves the section by the signal, which is not really what I want. Well, I hope you really enjoyed that video as much as I did putting this project together. And I'm actually really impressed with these LMiD detectors in being able to trigger that signal. And one of the things actually I've found is with a little bit of just fine tuning, actually on one of the detection zones, I reduced the number of windings through the coil on the LMiD. It said no more than 2, I put 2 on, and that did actually make it a little bit trigger happy with locomotives that pulled a large current. So I reduced that down to 1 turn on the advice of DCC Concepts after I talked with them about how this system was working, and that does seem to have cured any accidental triggering of the signal. But of course we've got that push button in the circuit, and that's obviously really important because we want to be able to reset the signal if it gets out of phase with the train, and it can do because of the nature of how these signals are triggered. They're not looking for an up or a down command, they're simply looking for completion of the circuit to do the next move in sequence, whether that's up if they're already down, or down if they're already up. But it does seem to be working really, really well. And this is a method which actually, I think I might add some more of these signals to Weir Yard in the future. It's really, really worked out well, and I'd like to thank DCC Concepts for sending over the LMiD for review. And we've got a link down below, not just for the Dapol signals, but also for the LMiD from DCC Concepts. But I must stress, do not power the LMiD if you're using it in this way. If you power it, it will destroy your Dapol signal. So I can't stress that more readily. Don't forget to tickle that like button and also consider sharing this stream. Let other people know about how easy this project was to complete. And if you haven't already done so, do consider subscribing to the channel, and you can check us out over on Patreon and support the channel to help us make the videos that you want to see. But until next time, this is me, Jenny Kirk, saying take great care of yourself. Bye for now. I'd like to send out a huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and an extra special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Offshore Allen, oorail.co.uk, Michael Lockie, Helen Sink, Peter Bolton, Brian and Dorothy Mudd, Gary Lewis, David Quinn, Sparky107107, George Botterini, Chris Moss, Robert Steers, MD of San Juan Model Company and Grantline Products, Sam Yates, Dale Williams, John N. from NC, NYMRish, Jonathan Foster, Peter, Graham Foster, Clifford Ison, Larry W. Grant, and NI Railways 4000 class. Thank you. Without you guys, I couldn't do this.